Welcome to the interview series by South Asia Research Institute for Minorities. I am your host, Syeda, Kissa, Zehra. We are having an outstanding personality today with us, Dr. Tanweer Fazal. He belongs to India, political sociologist and professor, Department of Sociology, University of Hyderabad, research consultant at SARIM Committee 2006. So let's welcome him. Hello, sir. It's been an honor for us to have you today. Thank you for accepting our invitation. So, my very first question is, as a political sociology expert, you are particularly interested in sociology of nationalism and nationhood, minorities and ethnic identities, and social movement. We would like to hear about your predilections turned to deal with such sensitive and critical concerns.
Yeah, as a political sociologist, this is the task to investigate or interrogate the relationship between the state and citizen. Now, this could be mediated in various different ways. The relationship between state and citizen, as well as non-citizens, because the categorization of who is to be a citizen and who is to be a non-citizen is also a state-driven project, which we have witnessed very often in South Asia, and particularly very recently in India too, after the Citizenship Amendment Act. Many of you would be familiar about it. I'll come to it later. But the question, of course, is that as I see political sociology as is a question of studying power and particularly the distribution of power in a society. And here in my specific interest has been to comprehend and understand the formation of nationalisms and the foundation of nation states, and from particular perspective of how it is to be viewed from the perspective of minority entitlements, because this relationship usually is seen as extremely tense, whether in Europe, where the nation state system was born, or in the rest of the world, wherever it is copied. The whole idea about the state founders is to, or the national elite is to somehow create a sort of a cultural homogeneity called nation. But this in itself creates problems for the minorities, who probably would wish to maintain their distinctiveness, their own cultural practices, their own language, religion, etc. So in the past, this relationship was seen with some amount of suspicion that minorities may not be necessarily loyal because they are not national, as in terms of the theorizations of these nationalist leaders. However, the question is that how do we see, are there other ways of looking at it? What kind of entitlements can minorities also expect? And how are the states to assure them? What should be the nature and character of such states? These are the questions which I engage with.
Dr. Fazal, I'm excited to learn about the SARIM committee. Being a senior consultant to the Prime Minister Manmohan Singh high-level committee is a great accomplishment. What are the key conclusions reached by SARIM committee on social, economical and educational status of India's Muslim community?
Zehra, this is such a committee. It is named after one of the very renowned human rights activist, as well as a former judge of the Indian High Court, the Delhi High Court, called Rajendra Sachar. Sachar Saab recently passed away. It is popularly referred to as Sachar Committee, but its official name is Prime Minister's High-Level Committee to study the social, educational, and economic status of Muslims of India. This was constituted in 2005, and it submitted its report in 2006. The task assigned to the Sachar committee, it constituted of experts, particularly drawn from social sciences, sociologists, economists, developmental specialists, etc. And the task assigned was to understand the extent to which the developmental march of India, particularly post-independence, the extent to which the minorities have been able to draw benefits, participate in it, and thus, some amount of developmental benefits have reached them. Interestingly, as the committee started its work, it looked into various dimensions. It also looked into not only the question about what kind of economic development or educational achievements the Muslim minorities in India have been able to make, but it also looked internally. It also looked into status differentiation which exists within Muslim society amongst different strata of population. In India and Pakistan, many of South Asia, it is also referred to as caste, etc. The Searcher Committee ultimately came to a conclusion that on various developmental paradigm, Muslims, though a differentiated category, but when it compared, when it is compared with other religious communities, falls behind. It falls behind in education, it falls behind in economic development, and its various different indices such as amount of bank loan which reaches Muslims, or amount of entrepreneurship which has been encouraged amongst Muslims, or the amount of, say, school dropout rate, which is supposedly higher than other communities. So these were the questions which it was interested in, and it on these parameters, it came to a conclusion that Muslims were, as an entirety, although there, as I said, there are different layers amongst Muslims themselves. There is also a category of Muslims who are, sufficiently affluent, but there is a very small percentage compared to that level of affluence which can be seen on other communities. So the Searcher Committee also argued that, well, if we see, Muslims are not a homogeneous community. All right. So along with status differentiations, you also see Muslims in different parts of the country. The developmental profile of Muslim living in Bengal or Bihar is not the same as a Muslim living in Kerala, for instance, which is far more developed a state compared to the states of Bengal and Bihar. So even on developmental paradigms too, Muslims did not appear as same, as a homogeneous community. Culturally, of course, they were diverse.
The next question is, the Justice Rajinder Sachar Commission's recommendations have not been implemented after 15 years. What are the most important reasons behind this failure?
I won't say that they have not been implemented at all. In fact, the Sachar Committee did not make any specific or exclusive, recommendation for Muslims, because the committee in itself, in its own understanding, argued that the problem of the Muslims are by and large threefold. One, because a large section of Muslims are poor, they face similar kinds of problems as poor of any other community would do. This is another thing, that the number of poor, or the proportion of poor among Muslims, was fairly larger than other communities. So on account of poverty, they had certain kind of problems, and this was faced with by all communities who had a poor population. The second category, of course, was its commonality with other religious minorities. So there are other certain questions, particularly related to identity or security, etc., which Muslims faced, but this was a question which many other minority communities too faced it. And the third one was specifically Muslim. This again had a range of different questions, including, say, for example, when I said that even if we take the question of poverty, the amount of poverty which is seen amongst the Muslims, particularly in eastern and northern India, is huge. And in terms of also the everyday violence which is faced by them, the question of security too is multifold, far more than, say, when we compare to different religious communities in India. All right. So therefore, the Sacha committee did not make any specific recommendation. Either it made recommendation which could be, help, which could have helped the poverty-ridden society in general, or it made recommendations which were, helpful to minorities of, different or different minorities as well. For example, it argued for a diversity index. It argued that there should be a diversity index maintained by all institutions, all government institutions. This would mean that they would be held accountable for if there was a level of diversity much lesser than what it should be expected. Say, for example, there is a university which has very small number of people from different religious or other or ethnic backgrounds. It would have to present that report. It would have to show that, see that this is what their composition of the employees as well as its education, its student composition is like. And the Sachar committee suggested that there should be an incentive given to those who maintain higher diversity. All right. So that was a diversity index which would be helpful to all communities. Secondly, it also argued, for example, for an equal opportunity commission. An equal opportunity commission, it argued, should be such that it should be accessible to all vulnerable communities, and individuals within these vulnerable communities, if they felt that they were discriminated against on account of their faith or on account of the culture to which they belong, they could have approached the Equal Opportunity Commission, which could have investigated and issued sermons, sanctions, etc. Apart from it, there were other kinds of recommendations like, increasing bank flow to increase of bank loan, disbursement of bank loan to Muslims, opening of ATMs, etc., or bank branches in Muslim or minority localities. These, to a certain extent, were also implemented by the UPA government led by Dr. Manmohan Singh. But when we are talking about Equal Opportunity Commission as well as Diversity Index, this could not see the light of the day.
As an author, you have written several books, one of which is The Minorities Conundrum, Living in Majoritian Times, in which you discuss the manner of minorities from the time of Babri Masjid to present. Can you tell me how many eras have gone in which Indian Muslim has been compromised and oppressed, and what the future hold for them in India? Is there any progress?
Indian Muslims, as I said, are the largest minority in India in terms of religious minorities. When we're talking about, they constitute the largest minority, and as a result, many of the problems which the minority face, a large amount of them come to them. For example, the questions related to security. There has been, since the beginning of the colonial rule onwards, we have seen the emergence of interreligious violence in India. And this interreligious violence, ultimately, the kind of divisions which it created in the society as well as polity, it ultimately also culminated in the partition of the subcontinent. As a minority, Muslims in India have continued to, face violence in various different contexts. during the partition riots on this side of the border, it were the Muslims who faced the you know uh, the mobs, and the other side of the border, it were the Sikhs and the Hindus. But for 20 years almost after the partition, there was a certain amount of peace which prevailed. That was probably the impact of the national movement, as well as the post-conflict period of peace which we all have seen in many different countries. So partition violence was so immense, enormous, that after that we see that there have been, for 20 years at least, there will be a peaceful existence. But since then, again, at regular interruptions, there have been communal violence. Muslims have faced it. There is a political scientist and political sociologist, Professor Paul Brass, who calls it as calls such incidents of violence as pogroms, as anti-minority or anti-Muslim pogroms, because according to him, they were targeted against Muslims, and it was the Muslims who faced the worst. So for him, category like riot, etc., is a misconception, because it does not really capture the fact that the violence was targeted violence. But again, apart from Muslims, the Sikhs in the 1984, or the Christians in many parts of the country, continue to face that majoritarian violence targeted against them. But at the same time, I must also say that in the there has been in the past, of course, that there have been also attempts from the state side of the state to address these questions. Almost after every act of violence, there has been a riot inquiry commission which has been instituted. And most often the riot inquiry commissions have held officials responsible, have held communal organizations responsible. But eventually we see that very little has been done on the front of justice. And that is a sad commentary.
Yeah, all right. Thank you for your words. So what is the main focus of your publication, and how can it educate individuals about their entitlements and uncovered reality in terms of promoting, protecting, and ensuring minority rights?
Those are too many expectations from a poor professor. But the only thing I can say is that as a political sociologist, I approach the question from the disciplinary location. And there's questions which are of my interest. These have been changing also over a period of time. So for instance, if I was working on nationalism and minority question earlier, my more recent interest has been on the question of collective violence. These are, also, in various ways, depending on the context, etc., or emerging questions from the society too, that the intellectuals try to, gear their, focus, etc. That way, one can say that amongst my interests has been this question broadly, the idea of nationalism and how it is constituted, or how it has manifested in various different ways. To certain extent, South Asia also has been a question of, a question which has been, of interest to me. And one of my works is titled Minority Nationalisms in South Asia, where there are different contributors to that volume. But as I argue that the minority question in South Asia are of three different kinds. That the minorities in South Asia, we can say, are those which are, sort of a national minorities. They are nations in themselves or ethnic communities living within their what they call it as homelands. And these communities or national minorities, you may say, uh, off and on have raised different kinds of questions. Uh, for example, in India, the question of the Nagas for self-determination, or in in Pakistan, the similar question emerges in the form of the Baluchs' demand for self-determination, or in Sri Lanka, we see how earlier the LTT or the Tamils of Sri Lanka raised the demand for a Tamil Elam. So that is one set of minorities who see the question in a different way. They'll want sovereignty or self-governance rights. Then we also have dispersed minorities, largely religious minorities. So, for example, Muslims in India are dispersed. They are not concentrated in any homeland. They do not have in India any homeland dreams as well. What they want or what they expect is share in economic wealth as well as share in the distribution of power. Uh, Equality is what they aspire for, along with the question of security. This is Muslims in India are could be referred to as a dispersed minority. Is similar way other religious minorities in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, or in Sri Lanka could be referred to as dispersed minorities who also have similar kind of expectations. And the third category, I would say, are those which are the indigenous communities. In India, these are the tribes. These are small groups, again, living within their own areas of existence. They see those areas as their sacred territories, and they expect certain kind of, not necessarily sovereignty, but certain amount of self-governance, protection of their language, of their different religious forms, things like those. The states in South Asia, strangely, irrespective of whether they are secular democracies or bordering on theocracies or whatever you refer to them as, a new term which is used by uh, Israeli social scientist Samuha, called ethnic democracy. So some of the states may also be in South Asia coming very close to this kind of a definition of an ethnic democracy. An ethnic democracy where the state itself is oriented towards maintaining the dominance of a dominant ethnic community. Irrespective of whether they are secular democracies, whether they have been liberal democracies, consociational democracy, or ethnic democracy, the states in South Asia more or less have identically responded to the minority question. The first category, which I refer to as the national minorities living in their own cultural enclaves, asking for national self-determination rights, the response have been most brutal from the state. So whether it is the Pakistani state or Sri Lankan state or Indian state, there is a whole history of violence against them, a whole history of violation of human rights against them, a whole history of incarcerations, etc. There is a brutal force of the state which is deployed against this demand and this kind of a cultural collective. To a certain extent, the expectations of the ethnic or indigenous communities have been addressed constitutionally, at least in India. So you have a Scheduled Tribes Act, which ensures that in proportion to the population, they get representation in the parliament, as well as in various different beneficiary-oriented schemes, also in government employment. But at the same time, they are today faced with another kind of a challenge. This is a challenge because of liberalization, or what we call it as market-driven globalization. So massive mining companies, Multinational corporations are invading these lands on which the tribals live. These are also usually rich with mineral resources, etc. And they are now faced with a different kind of a challenge. The third category, that is the dispersed minorities. The dispersed minorities in different parts of the South Asia have faced frequent, violence. You see, recently in Bangladesh, there has been attack on the Hindu minorities. We keep listening to reports from similar kind of violence perpetrated against the Christians in India as well as Pakistan, or the case of the Muslims of Pakistan is not Pakistan, I'm sorry, of India is very well known. So that is how I see that things in South Asia have moved vis-a-vis the question of minorities. What I would like to argue is that if you see the kind of solutions which the Britishers probably sought to resolve the inter-ethnic or inter-religious strife in India, in fact, what they attempted was to ultimately divide territories, geographies, and create separate sort of homelands. But the question, moral, in many situations, are interrelated or are interconnected. And hence, a solution many times of minorities within a given state is difficult to achieve. And hence, one should think about a South Asian sort of a solution. And this South Asian solution, we can come to it later. There can be various different kind of experiments made and tried and tested once as well. However, we can come back to it a little later. Yeah.
So, South Asian history ensures religion minority safety and stability. The graph of social justice, community building, minority identity, and collective violence deteriorating. Why and how did this happen?
Why we may have to go back into history. We might go back into probably colonial history and how the colonial history relied on certain kind of categorizations. Then the colonial policy relied on certain kind of categorizations, which resulted in the reinforcement of boundaries between communities. The communities which, although were different, one may not say necessarily that the Hindus and the Muslims were completely similar in terms of their practice. But there was a lot of cultural exchange and which continues to exist. But this categorization of boundaries coinciding many times with political demands and things like that resulted in certain amount of hatred towards each other, particularly mediated through politics, and this has continued. Religion is an easy ground for political mobilization. So many political forces which who wish to make a mark rely on religious kind of mobilizations. At the same time, there is also the growth of fundamentalism as well as fascistic tendencies within South Asia. The growth of these kind of organizations as well as politics too has resulted in perpetual violence against the minorities.
Thank you. Could you please explain and justify the trajectory of India's secular democracy? In India, secularism entails taking a neutral position towards all religion. Unfortunately, such equidistance never materialized. Do you agree with this statement?
That has not materialized. Indian secularism is, in practice, not similar to, say, for example, the European idea of secularism or the French idea of secularism. So it is not necessarily creates a wall of separation between religion and politics or religion and state. But what it expected was that it would be treating equally people from different religious communities. That is the constitutional promise as well. And insofar as the legal or the constitutional mechanism is considered, that equality uh, continues to hold, in its formal structure. But when it comes to the implementation of the practice, we see huge problems. And these problems are probably because of the prevailing animosities and prejudices which continue to exist within the society. Ultimately, whatever is jotted down in the constitution, etc. But the people or the context in which it is operationalized, if that remains thoroughly divided and thoroughly prejudice driven or strived on, then ultimately all those promises, all those formal assurances may not come down, and make ensure that it is also maintained in practice. So as a result, you see that the bureaucracy also at times turns partisan. The police and the lower judiciary many times turns partisan. As a result of which, we see a whole history of justice being denied, of equality, the promise of equality being negated. All this we see as happening. Besides, there is also a majoritarian tendency within the state itself. This is not only in India, but in all states of South Asia. And if you try to go into the analysis, you'll find actually many states in the world tend to lean towards the majoritarian cultural system. Say, for example, the sort of look at Germany, for example. Germany's, although there is no violence largely against the the minorities, but its citizenship laws have a very clear German ethnic sort of a demand or requirement that you have to be ethnically German to get it. And those who are not, for them, it is a long and tortuous process to get German citizenship, irrespective of whether you have been a resident German for a long period of time. So, yeah, those are the questions which we have and we continue to have in India.
Thank you so much, sir. What is the relationship between transitional justice procedure and the level of violence and reconciliation in a post-authoritarian or post-war society? In the post-conflict nation, how can transitional justice aid national reconciliation?
Well, when we come to the question of transitional justice, this is, I think, a coinage which emerged after the South African experience. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, instituted in South Asia, South Africa, after the end of the apartheid regime. With the coming of the African National Congress into power, backed by the black majority, the omissions and commissions of the of the apartheid regime, which preceded this, it came to be investigated, interrogated, and the whole transitional justice idea worked on the basis that there will be a general forgiveness insofar as there was an acceptance of the culpability. So if those who were the perpetrators, they accepted their culpability, sought forgiveness, for instance, a promise of amnesty came by. Now, what is crucial in this case was that there was a regime change, first. Secondly, after the regime change, those who were the victims of violence earlier, or representatives of those who were victims of violence, came to power. The situation was completely altered now. In such a situation, the victim was in now a situation to say that if you agree to what you've done, if you accept, I can forgive you. So the victim now in a position, from a position of power, was trying to suggest that if we are to live together, accept your guilt and there can be a way, we can find a way out. Now, this regime change has not taken place in most post-conflict societies. Although there was a lot of problem and criticism about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa too. In fact, the same experiment could not be repeated in many other places wherever genocide, etc. was happened. But at least in South African case, that experiment, which has now become an example for the rest of the world. The crucial requirement, of course, is regime change. In India, for example, you see, the Gujarat violence of 2002. Now, who would forgive whom? There was no change of government post-violence. In fact, the same party continued to come back with greater, strength back to power. It was not necessarily inclined towards seriously investigating questions of violence. And when there was no identification of the culprits, where would be the question of general amnesty? This is a, it is a fine line, but it is something very important. That the victims continue to be victimized, and hence the forgiveness here would have meant complete impunity for the perpetrators. Similarly, in the case of 1984 Sikh violence too. So the transitional justice system works in some situations, but not in all situations. Ultimately, the victims do want justice. And justice where they would like to see those who have killed their near and dear ones, those who have, perpetrated insurmountable amount of violence on them, including all kinds of, women have faced sexual violence, massive sexual violence during such episodes. They require justice to be delivered. And if transitional justice becomes a mechanism to bypass justice, that would not be, acceptable to the victims of violence.
So, since Justice G. Rohini's panel released a draft proposal suggesting a subcategorization of reservations for the other backward classes, there have been rising call for a caste census to coincide with a general census in 2022. What importance do you think the caste census has?
I know we have moved to another kind of a question altogether, and this is also something of interest to me. Thanks for bringing the discussion towards this. Yes, the caste census is a raging question in India. There are a lot of people who are actively now demanding that there should be a caste census. Let me remind you that the last census in which the caste communities were enumerated was 1931 colonial census. And post independence, that practice was stopped. Much of South Asia, as I would say, is a caste-ridden society. Some states have come to accept the reality, the others continue to deny it, insofar as legal and constitutional positions are considered. In the Indian situation, following the Government of India Act 1935, the Indian Constitution also accepts scheduled castes and scheduled tribes as constitutional categories. The scheduled castes have continued to be counted even in post-colonial censuses. But the question today is about the counting of rest of the caste groups, and particularly this demand is coming most vociferously from the leaders and political formations belonging to other backward classes, the OBCs. There are a lot of problems with the caste census. One, of course, is that it is very difficult to enumerate caste groups, because from village to village, cities to cities, as a sociologist, I can tell you that there is such huge diversity that in terms of titles, surnames, the caste which they identify themselves with, the caste names also. The Mandal Commission estimated that those who belong to other backward classes in the country belong to something like 3,743 castes. Now, this was only about OBC. When we are talking about caste census, it would mean the entire Indian population to be divided into various different castes. So, locally, regionally as well, there is a huge diversity in terms of castes. That is one problem, of course. But this problem is not something which is which cannot be overcome. This is a problem of a complication, but there are ways of overcoming this problem. The main problem, of course, is, as it is felt, that enumeration of castes might create a new or give a new energy to caste-based mobilizations in India. That the moment the caste groups come to realize, particularly other backward classes, etc., that the numbers are far more than the share which they are getting in terms of, again, development, social development, etc. It is assumed that there will be greater demand for the share in the national wealth in accordance with the share in population. This in itself is something which the elites may not like to have. So there is a problem there with the caste census. And therefore we see that there are various different ways through which it is being stopped, it is being blocked. Although almost all political parties in India, except for the ruling party, have demanded a caste-based census. Census is a regular, 10-year exercise in India. The census office, the registrar of censuses, that office is quite well equipped as well as experienced to be able to carry out such an enumeration. But a political decision has to be made, and which has not been made so far.
What strategies can help resolving anti-Muslim sentiments, and what strategies have been adopted in the past?
The strategies, depend on the diagnosis of the problem. There are various different ways in which this problem has been understood by different sections of the population. There is a section of the civil society which believes that this is a result of, misunderstandings between communities. So they look for a different kind of a solution. They try to, bring the communities together, organize joint actions, organize NGO driven activities, bringing, people into meeting each other, creating situations like that. And they feel that this is the one way through which the stereotypes, the prejudices will be, diminished. But and then you also have, whole section of people who argue along interfaith dialogue. Again, it is based on this assumption. There's a wide amount of, there's a large amount of misconception, that there is or misgivings about each other, and these can be overcome if we get to know each other's religion, each other's texts, and religious practices. However, my diagnosis would be different, and I would argue that one has to look at the political nature of such skirmishes. That these are not spontaneous outbursts. That there is a long period of organized activity, including the agenda of certain communal organizations, to foment trouble and to create divisions and to mobilize on that basis for political gains. If we go into the history of communal violence in India, we'll find that it coincides with the emergence of representative form of government. And this was in the colonial period. As election became a basis for choosing your representative, and who would some way or the other form the government. That was the origin of politics or political mobilization, and that is also the period of the origin of massive interreligious violence. So if we come to this kind of an agreement that the violence is essentially political in nature, all cultures and communities who live close by have various kinds of cultural exchanges between them, various kinds of common customary cultural practices. At the same time, there are also misconceptions and stereotypes and prejudices about each other. But violence requires a certain amount of enactment, which is done through certain deliberate acts. And that, if is accepted and recognized, probably we'll be able to actually contain it. It has to be, recognized and accepted not only by the society, but primarily by the functionaries of the state. And there are also studies which show that wherever the state functionaries were inclined towards containing violence, they were able to do it effectively.
True, thanks a lot. So, can you tell me how can regional organization be more effective in safeguarding minority identities, avoiding collective violence, and combating minority rights violation? Do you believe a regional level platform would be useful?
Yeah, I think the regional, if you're talking about South Asia kind of an initiative, a forum which brings all South Asian countries together, I believe that that is actually one way in which many of our problems related to this, this kind of a hostility and and animosity between cultures, etc., can be resolved. And I many times look positively towards something like the European Union. You know, the European Union has a European Parliament. In the European Parliament, even those nations and ethnicities get representation which do not get representation in their own parliaments. So, as a result, the recognition which they aspire for is addressed to a certain extent, and within their own parliaments and governments, the European Union solution, is a model which ensures also that states adhere to certain amount of human rights and cultural rights, etc. So that is one model. One can see how it functions. It might be more effective in the European context. We may have to, develop it further. We may have to bring it in tune with the South Asian reality. But nevertheless, this sort of effort is required primarily because the questions are interrelated and interconnected. The conflict in India has its repercussions in the rest of South Asia. The problems in Assam, for example, related to the National Register of Citizens as well as Citizenship Amendment Act, which has resulted in nearly 19 million people. Sorry, nearly. I'm now confused about numbers, but a large number of people. Let's see, stateless almost. This has also its bearing on other South Asian states. So what we need to have is a sort of a South Asian platform, but an empowered one, not one like SARC, which has almost become a toothless sort of a body, but something and an empowered institution which can also be based on certain foundational principles and certain kind of moralities related to rights of culture, rights of humans, etc.
So how can SARIM collaborate with you to promote minority right in the region?
I think that's a responsibility of every right thinking individual as well as institution, that the region remains peaceful, that the region's vulnerable groups don't feel left out, that the constitutions ensure and guarantee their rights, that the rest of the civil society ensures that those guaranteed rights are actually in practice to become evident. So this is a responsibility for everyone, including an organization like SARIM. I am not completely aware with the SARIM's objectives, etc. But insofar as research and such activities which are academically or intellectually inclined, I would be happy to be associated with it. That is what my expertise is, and that is how I see the problem as, that there has to be a lot of intellectual investment into understanding this problem, and thus a solution can be achieved only when we have been able to actually been able to comprehend it well. So SARIM sort of an organization and an institution needs to be built in every state, and and therefore I believe that it should be able to expand its activities, particularly those related to research and advocacy.
Thank you so much, sir. Last but not least, I would like to thank you for your time and invite you for our conference. Would you want to join us in Pakistan for next gathering if the global pandemic situation gets stable?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for the invitation. And I can't say now that how things are going to turn out later, but I most happily and would accept your invite. And let's see how we are able to collaborate and work together. In a conference in Pakistan would be an interesting thing. And yeah, I will be happy to be part of it.
Thank you so much, sir. Please accept our sincere appreciation for your outstanding answers you made today. It was very interesting to hear about the ground reality. Thank you for sharing your time and experiences with us. Take care. Goodbye. Good luck.
Thank you, Zehra, and thank you, Khuram, as well. And best wishes to SARIM.